primeiro foi o 11 de setembro. 10 anos depois é revoltar contra tiranos e corruptos. No meio da turbulência, importa refletir sobre o papel do Islão no Ocidente e o seu lugar na Europa.
Estamos em Beirute, uma das pérolas do Médio Oriente. Esta zona já foi um dia destruída por uma guerra civil e Beirute e o Líbano é, de certa forma, o símbolo de tudo aquilo que estamos aqui a fazer. Já houve aqui guerras civis, já houve aqui guerras com Israel, já houve conflitos sangrentos entre muçulmanos e cristãos, drusos e outros grupos, e hoje estamos numa paz aparente, na medida em que estamos mesmo ao lado da Síria, que está a começar a inflamar-se, e a 2 passos da Líbia e dos outros países que vivem momentos de turbulência, de revolta e de revolução. E é sobre tudo isto que vimos falar. Conflito e consenso no mundo árabe, conflito e consenso entre o mundo islâmico e o mundo ocidental. No fundo, devíamos tentar responder à velha pergunta: o que é que existe entre as civilizações? Choque ou aliança? Alistair Crooke, o nosso primeiro convidado, é um historiador, um conhecido investigador britânico, preside ao Conflict Forum, que é a única organização de resolução de conflitos ocidental estabelecida no Médio Oriente. Alistair Crooke já foi agente do MI6, os serviços secretos britânicos, esteve empenhado em muitos processos de paz, a começar pelo difícil processo da Irlanda, e está hoje em Beirute destinado a promover a concordância, o diálogo entre civilizações. E a nossa conversa é sobre isso. O que é que temos hoje entre Ocidente e Islão? Choque ou aliança de civilizações? Ou pura e simplesmente incompreensão?
It is that, but actually also I think it is something much more deep. I'm talking about structures of thinking. But first of all, of course, there is, if you like, a system of thinking into which the West places Islam, which is a very rigid and very structured series of objects. Iran, the Middle East has become a thing, an object, a structure. It has impermeable edges. It is solid. There is an element of that, but more importantly, there is a way of being and a way of thinking that is very different. If you look at the structures of thinking between Islam and the West, there are differences. The West, structurally, the thinking is structurally agnostic. That's how it is. People may or may not be agnostic, but the structure of thinking is agnostic. In Islam, in the intellectual tradition at least, the structure of thinking cannot be secular because of its structure, not whether people are secular or not. So you do have big differences about how people think. But on top of that, I think that what you're dealing with is not simply, if you like, an incomprehension or an unwillingness to understand, but what is happening with the resurgence of Islam is, in a sense, something that is deeply threatening to people who are committed, who were involved in the Enlightenment and seeing the progress of science and empiricism, and a particular rationalist way of thinking is becoming the inevitable end of humanity.
Let's talk a bit on an old theme, clash of civilizations versus alliance of civilization. In the beginning, when Huntington wrote the famous pamphlet or book, what he said is that when certain forms of ideological behavior collapse, we'll see that there are other forms of people opposing each other around culture, religion, etc. So it didn't look to me as such a scandal what you were saying. But certain people brought that into some sort of a prophecy. It has to be like this. It has to go that way. And then you have an answer saying there is a way to stop it, which is, okay, there are different civilizations, but we should be allied instead of clashing. How do you see this problem?
I think that the idea of the civilization that Huntington was talking about goes back to an old model whereby Protestant, if you like, Anglo-Saxon thinking saw humanity on a single track of progress, if you like, that was both based on science, on empiricism, and on rationalism. And that other aspects, religion and culture and other aspects...
The future would always be better than the past.
The future will be better, and that religion and other things almost became cultural lifestyle choices. You could do it, but were if you like, apart. But those cultural lifestyle choices could be irritating, could be contradictory, could hold societies back. So that was the concept of it. And what I was trying to say to you earlier is that I think we're talking about something that is actually much more profound. It is a question of a way of living. A way of living and a way of seeing and a way of thinking that is very different. It is the attempt to bring back different aspects into thinking. The whole of that thinking was based on the sense of the sovereignty of the individual, and that human beings, had no need for superstition, for the sense of a religious or a sacred sphere, that somehow rationalism, science and empiricism was enough to give people meaning in life through nationalism. And suddenly people are going back to something that happened before that great event and saying, no, that is not enough, that there is another way of living in the world which is based in values which are not simply utilitarian values, not values about self and self-advancement, but are values that are essentially irreducible to such concepts. And that search, if you like, for a human meaning today, for a sense of, what is the purpose? What is the purpose of society? I think lies when people talk about dignity is the sense of the narrowness and meaningless, the real sense of the endless, meaningless of existence.
Do Médio Oriente, chegámos a Whitechapel, o grande mercado islâmico de Londres. Eis o símbolo da maior comunidade muçulmana da Europa. Aqui crescem gerações que dão o seu melhor ao país que as acolheu, mas aqui tem crescido também a flor selvagem do fundamentalismo armado.
E estamos no meio da zona, talvez, muçulmana mais importante de Londres, onde temos o mercado, onde temos a vida real e onde, no fundo, a coexistência entre várias culturas é talvez o elemento mais importante que tem que se compreender nos tempos atuais. E com isto vamos falar também de Muhammad Bari, que durante muito tempo foi o dirigente máximo da comunidade muçulmana inglesa, do Muslim Council of Britain, e é com ele que lhe vamos perguntar exatamente qual a solução. Viver separados, viver integrados, aprender o inglês, ter liberdades civis e viver à parte, qual o caminho? É essa a pergunta.
Well, I don't think there's any perfect model, but what we try to do in Britain is accommodating people's cultural diversity and ethnic diversity, religious diversity, and of course within the pluralist Britain. And the debate is going on across Europe, including in Britain. And some people think that multiculturalism is dead, but we don't think it's dead. On the other hand, multiculturalism doesn't mean people living separate lives. What we want and expect from Muslim and other communities is to accommodate and exchange ideas, do not live parallel lives, live in a society where we integrate, positively integrate. I will not use the word absorption or something else. Yeah. Positive integration has been there in history all along, because people are different. Even within a family, people are different. Sure. So there is this difference, but this difference has to be subsumed within the overall broader British state.
And I guess that when we talk about integration, everyone has to integrate. I mean, Muslim or non-Muslim communities. Integration is a collective effort.
Process, yes.
I think that at the end what we want is that to share some values. One of them, I guess, it's equality in front of the law. We should all be equal.
Equality, tolerance, and respect, understanding, these are the values that we need. And we need to go further, probably. We need to appreciate each other's achievements. And that's also important, acknowledging, appreciating each other's achievements, and working together for the harmony and love, and all sorts of things are not only British values, these are universal human values.
A grande questão do momento é de sabermos quais as grandes causas das revoltas que varrem o Médio Oriente. Talvez um dos sítios melhores para compreender isto é Londres, onde estão intelectuais, trabalhadores, estudantes de todas as comunidades islâmicas do mundo. E o nosso primeiro convidado é Tariq Ramadan, um professor de Oxford, um professor islâmico, um professor controverso, que tem tentado liberalizar o Islão, por um lado, mas que também é acusado de ser um pensador anti-ocidental. Vamos tentar sabê-lo. Porque a pergunta e a resposta vai ser sobre o seguinte tema: por que se revoltam as massas, por que se revoltam as mulheres e os homens por todo o Médio Oriente?
There is a rationale behind the whole uprisings that we had, starting with Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and more importantly as well, other countries where we can see that there are signs of something which has happened. And I think that we need to have a comprehensive approach, which is both, don't forget the economy and what is happening on the ground, because this is, if we speak about mass protest, we should understand why these people are saying, no, that's enough now, it's too much. And then the political reasons. The economic reason is that if you just study what happened over the last 2 years before the Tunisian uprising, for example, is just the bread and rice price was just increasing. And this is the reality of the people saying, we are not living, we are surviving. And more than that, you are adding to our realities the basic things that we need to have just to be human beings are not there. And this was happening in Tunisia. It was happening in Egypt. So the ingredients, the economic factors is very important. On the daily life, the people were having problems to just survive. And this is what happened with Mohammed Bouazizi, where just he was mistreated and he felt that he was losing dignity, with people saying, no, you can't sell your goods here. So this is one dimension which is very important. And I think that in our understanding of the rational, the economic factors are very often missing when it comes to this. On the other side, you have people who have been living under dictatorships for years, where there is no freedom of expression, where there is corruption, when you have, a leader, a dictator, taking all the money and his families. Not only this, because it's quite important not to understand that it's not only behind a figure of Ben Ali and Mubarak. Behind them,
there is a structured system of kleptocracy.
And people who are corrupt people who are taking the money.
We didn't mention yet, and we were going to start to mention it, world religion. And there is a big debate. Is this a religious movement? Is it a religious movement in certain countries, maybe not in others? I mean, some people see it almost absent in Tunisia. They see it very much present in other cases. And there is a state, Iran, that threw some ashes into the fire, saying, no, this is about religion, and we think we are in the right side of history at this moment. Do you think anyone can claim the ownership of these revolutions?
No, I think that, and I said it from the very beginning, that the Islamist or political Islam in the Muslim majority countries, in Tunisia, Egypt, even Libya now, they can't say that this is our revolution, because the people were not, they never claim just to do it in the name of a so-called Islamic State or something like that. They were not talking about that. They were talking about freedom and justice and liberation. We don't want these corrupt regimes. Now, and this is where we have to be quite subtle here, this is not an Islamist, or these are not Islamist revolutions, but the people who were in the streets in Egypt or in Tunisia, they are still Muslims. They are Muslims, and these are Muslim majority countries. So we don't have, in order to avoid the political factor, to forget the religious reference of the people saying, yes, we are doing this. And it would be good for us in the West to get the message that these people, being Muslims, they are claiming and yearning for the same values as we are cherishing here, as we like here, when we talk about freedom and justice and democratic processes. And it's as if we still have in our reading of all things a binary vision. It's either Islamic or secular. No, we can have shared values and coming from different roots.
What I would like to know from you is, you've been famous for being thought-provoking when you write about Islam. One of the things people say about you is that you've been trying to reconcile the idea of Islam with the idea of reason. And you've been trying to do a new exegesis of the texts, not only concentrating on the language, but also on the meaning. Do you think that this effort is well seen in Muslim countries? I mean, do you think that people are interested in going beyond the text and going to the context and try to understand where does it come from, what does it mean?
You know, it's the struggle of our time. It's not only in the Muslim majority countries, it's even in the West, that you have to struggle against this emotional politics, emotional religions. Emotional religions is dangerous.
Yeah.
It's to confuse between what is spiritual and what is emotional. So we come with passionate and sometimes irrational religious thought. Religion is not irrational. It's with reason that you have a deep faith. So I think that what I'm trying to do is to resist this current, which is coming with globalization, is coming with this us versus them, and to get a sense that we need to reconcile faith and reason, and there is no other way to be reasonable in the way we are looking at the way we deal with these principles in our commitment to a religion. And I would tell you something which is quite interesting. For years we have been, you know, learning from Muslim majority countries because we were in the West. And now when I'm traveling to Muslim majority countries and trying to do the job and work about this, it's hard. You know, I go to Morocco, to the Middle East, to where I can go still, because there are some countries where it's still difficult.
Este projeto não teria sido possível sem o patrocínio, o alto apoio do British Council, o organismo que no fundo trata das relações culturais no Reino Unido. Tudo isto foi feito também ao abrigo do seu projeto Our Shared Europe, a nossa Europa partilhada, ou se quisermos, a nossa Europa comum. Ou seja, como é que conseguimos viver na Europa com tantas comunidades que às vezes parecem ter mais motivos para se detestar do que motivos para se aliar. É precisamente neste jardim tão difícil que é preciso fazer cultivar a flor delicada da tolerância e do contacto.